Hello, good afternoon, good morning and evening for those joining from faraway time zones. Thank you all very much for taking the time to contribute to this very timely and important issue. But a quick comment to start. I want to inform you that this session is being recorded for note-taking purposes. So again, welcome to this session organized by GPPAC and Radical Flexibility Fund as part of an ongoing project funded by the Knowledge Platform Management Fund. So this project seeks to reassess the current aid chain model and explore innovative thinking to identify new financing approaches with the support of peacebuilders and financing experts, three of whom you will hear from today. So my name is Aviella and I lead global advocacy at GPPAC. For those who don't know, GPPAC is a global network of more than 240 local grassroots civil society organizations that are actively working to prevent violent conflict and build more peaceful societies. GPPAC started working on this issue of financing for peace building last year when we lost funding from one of our long-standing funders. And this decision hit us particularly hard because a big part of GPPAC's budget is funneled directly towards local organizations who face tremendous challenges to directly access funding. However, what is encouraging is that across the board, we have found that there is an interest and an ambition to strengthen the position of local peace builders in the aid chain, as there is a wide acknowledgement that impactful peace building requires local actors to be in the lead. So what we aim to achieve with this work is to stimulate a can-do approach rather than to focus on the obstacle and challenges which we already know. So that brought us to partner with the Radical Flexibility Fund. So now I will hand over to Riva from the Radical Flexibility Fund, who will explain the specific focus and setup of today's conversation. Again, thank you all.
Great. Thank you so much, Marie-Laure, and good morning, good afternoon, good morning from New York City. My name is Riva Kantowitz, and I'm the founder of Radical Flexibility Fund. RFF is a new organization and a fund that supports new ways of financing local organizations that enable them to be empowered and sustainable. Our work brings together localized financing approaches that are currently scattered across the development ecosystem to demonstrate that people do fund their social change work in different ways. It is possible to get off the endless treadmill of grants, and particularly relevant to our conversation, we can apply this learning and these experiences to peace building. And Leo, if we could go to slide 2. As with all of our work at Radical Flexibility Fund, and as Marie-Laure noted, and including this specific project with GPPAC, what we aim to do is focus on what is possible, to lift up examples, work that is already happening, rather than focusing on the challenges and the obstacles, which are very well articulated. For this particular session, we decided to think about the role of the intermediary funder and what options there would be to shape this particular role in the aid chain so as to shift power to local peace builders to design and implement their own solutions to the challenges they face. Based on our ongoing conversations with donors, we know that it's unlikely that this role will disappear, in large part due to their own capacity restraints to manage lots and lots of small grants to local organizations. What we see increasingly is that donors, in their calls for proposals, make it mandatory for an intermediary to work in partnership with Southern organizations. But what we don't see enough is a specification of how that partnership should operate in order to ensure an equal relationship that is not purely transactional. Further, there needs to be more specific guidelines regarding how donors can ensure that the local organization organizations that are included in the partnership are in fact local, meaning community-based rather than country offices of INGOs. And moving to slide 3. Thank you. In practice, we see partnerships still do not put these types of local organizations in the lead. And by that, we mean in terms of design, where the bulk of the funding goes, engaging with donors and access to the discourse at the international level, et cetera. And we see that the thinking about the role of the intermediary is most often driven by technical requirements. For example, who is best suited to manage the administrative burden of projects? We would like to move beyond this limited thinking and instead focus on the role of the intermediary in terms of being responsible for an equitable partnership and ensuring local organizations are in the operational, programmatic, and thought partner lead in terms of their peace building work. So to get us, so as you see from our slide, we've articulated a few things that we think are sort of the old way of approaching this discussion. And to get us thinking, we wanted to ask you to take a quick poll. So we wanted to ask you to think about what is most important to ensuring that relationships between intermediaries and local partners are equal and not transactional. And we've listed a few items. And so I think the poll should appear. There we go. Perfect. And we'll give you all a few minutes to answer our question. See, I see we only have one participant, and I think you.
I'm not sure it's open for participants to vote, or at least I don't see how to do it.
Let's see, Leo, is there a way to open it?
Apologies, we seem to be having a very minor technical difficulty with the poll. I have it open, but it doesn't seem to be sharing with participants. Please just allow me one moment.
Sure.
My apologies, but Zoom seems to have deleted the poll or terminated on its own.
Okay,
so sorry
well, this
about
was
that.
no worries at all. These things happen. Let's just move on. But you all get the idea that we were trying to sort of articulate these qualities that would lend themselves to empowering local peace builders and speak to equitable partnerships versus the way the aid chain is currently structured. So, the idea of investing equal time and capacity, providing non-judgmental and neutral feedback, seeking out capacity building opportunities for both partners, and maintaining the relationship beyond the life of any one project. So this is the topic. We were hoping to get a sense of the room and what people think is most important, but this is the topic of our whole discussion today. So we aim to explore these issues, more in depth during our session. And by the end of the session, we're hoping to generate a list of concrete recommendations that could be taken into account by donors when developing their calls for proposals and project guidelines, and by intermediaries when they're advocating for locally led peace building and developing their proposals for funding. So in terms of today's discussion, I'm moderating the discussion today with support from our colleague Mariska van Denem, who many of you know. Mariska is the director of the Conflict Research Unit at the Clingendale Institute and has been working with us on this project in her capacity as a former board member of GPPAC and former chair of the Secretary General's advisory group to the UN Peacebuilding Fund. Mariska will help me keep the conversation on a positive and constructive track And again, we hope to avoid any sort of delving into all of the obstacles and all of the challenges and really stay focused on ways to move forward. How do we move from the rhetoric around this into action, as I often say? And she will also be providing us with closing remarks at the end of our session. So to kick us off, as Maria Laura noted, we have 4 wonderful people with us to make a pitch based on their experience and to provide us with some concrete recommendations from their perspective. 2 local peace builders, Lucy from East Jerusalem and Patrick from Uganda, 1 very experienced fund manager, our colleague Aviella from Northern Ireland, and 1 donor representative, Simon from the European Union Service for Foreign Policy Instruments. And so for the remaining time after we hear from our speakers, we really hope to engage in a conversation with you all and hear your thoughts and ideas, and hopefully generate this list that I mentioned of concrete recommendations for how to structure this role in a way that it empowers local organizations. And so with that, I will turn the floor over to Lucy.
Thank you, Riva. Thank you also, Mary-Laure, Mariska, GPAC, for this invitation, and for KPSRL for the event. It's an honor and a pleasure to be with you all. I'm Lucy Nasebi. I live and work in East Jerusalem. It's my home, where I set up a small NGO called Middle East Nonviolence and Democracy, MEND. And this organization has been a member of GPAC for 15 years, since GPAC was founded. I myself am chair of the Improving Practice Working Group at GPAC, a member of their Gender Core Group, and also an active participant in the MENA region, the MENAPAC aspect of GPAC. So in terms of intermediaries, there was a time before the Oslo Peace Accords at the beginning of the 1990s, when local Palestinian peacebuilding organizations could get direct funding from donors such as the EU. At this time too, there was a really thriving Palestinian civil society, but with increasingly stringent fiduciary requirements, more complex reporting mechanisms, bigger project budgets combined with limited staff capacity from donors to manage the awarded projects, along also with an influx of international NGOs wanting to get engaged in the peace process. This system shifted to working through these intermediary mechanisms, and thus this trend has been undermining the reputation, position, and capacity of local organizations in the aid chain. My organization, MEND, for instance, had to adapt to this shift by increasingly working with intermediaries. I would like to share with you 3 examples, in two of which the relationship was mutually beneficial and one where it was not. And with these in mind, I will also suggest the following 3 recommendations that you see on your screen. First, PACS, a leading peacebuilding NGO based in Utrecht in the Netherlands, has partnered with MEND on several projects and in different capacities, with MEND as simply the recipient of aid with no share in the proposal drafting process, as a recipient with a share in the process, and as a partner, as part of a consortium, currently, for instance, working from the outset on the design and drafting of the proposal. From the beginning, this partnership has been based on an equal, even perhaps altruistic, investment of time, capacity, and resources to support not only the implementation of the project, but also, and perhaps more importantly, to deepen the relationship. PACS, representatives of PACS, visit the region frequently and also regularly invite MEND and other partners to strategic planning meetings, whether in the Netherlands or in the region, for instance, in Amman. While reporting requirements could make the partnership transactional, this has not ever been the case with PACS. They continuously provide only non-judgmental feedback insofar as they seek to develop our skills and capacities. It is very much a partnership based on an equal footing and on mutual respect. Secondly, MEND has been a member of GPAC for a long time and together we have worked on several project proposals. When projects were not selected by donors, GPAC went the extra mile to identify other opportunities to adapt or perhaps retailor the proposal in such a way that men's often considerable investment was not lost. For instance, a proposal rejected at the full proposal stage by the EU was successfully adapted for a UN Peacebuilding Fund project in Kyrgyzstan, with men taking on the role as advisors and trainers for the local partners there, thereby transferring knowledge and capacity and increasing the learning within the GPAC network. This type of partnership with GPAC exemplifies two elements of an equal partnership. One, working together on the design of a project proposal, and two, acknowledging the ownership of the design by meaningfully including men in other similar projects. The partnership goes beyond project submission and implementation to ensure a return of investment, especially for the local partner. Third, and this is, I'm afraid, a negative example, we were some time ago approached by an organization in the US to design a project proposal. We ended up writing most of the proposal since we were the ones with the initial concept, along with the local knowledge and experience. However, we were only allocated 10% of the total budget. And although the project went well, it left. In the end, it did not give the feeling of an equal partnership. And on the contrary, we felt used. Based on these examples, I would like to offer the following recommendations. First, allow the budget to be spent on the relationship building between the intermediary and the local partner, such as during the design, regular adaptation of the project, and also to allow for the local partner to travel and meet regularly with the donor, along with the intermediary. Second, create a requirement so that the ratio between staff allocation for local partners and intermediary is always at the advantage of local partners. This also means that if local partners do not have a certain type of capacity, the budget should allow them to build it with the support of the intermediary, instead of the intermediary fully budgeting for it. 3, allow for sufficient overheads to cover the costs for the local organization. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lucy. And now we will move on to Patrick.
Thank you very much. Greetings from Uganda. I'm Patrick Wile, and I work with the Profit Peacebuilding organization called Center for Conflict Resolution. It's based in Kampala, Uganda. I work as the program coordinator in charge of peacebuilding, and Center for Conflict Resolution is also the secretariat, the regional secretariat for GPAC, East and Central Africa, where we coordinate peace activities in 16 countries. But today I will share with you our experience partnering with GPAC in a multi-phase project funded by the German Foreign Ministry via IFA Civic Prevention Program. The project is popularly known as the Youth Peace Champions Project. In 2019 and 2020, GPAC was the intermediary for this project. But today I'm proud to say that from 2021, which is this year, our organization is now getting funds directly from IFA Civic without support of GPAC. For the 2 years we had this partnership, we considered it as a very great partnership. And this is what I believe made it possible. One, the partnership was based on the understanding that the intermediary role was temporary. What happened is that from the design phase, GPAC had a transition strategy in mind. It shared this strategy with us. We also shared with the local stakeholders and communities who are the beneficiaries. And it was also shared with the donor. Also, from this strategy, GPAC and our organization jointly then identified which capacities needed to be built and strengthened in order to make it possible for us to be able to take on the role. of implementing directly. And from this approach, we saw about 90% of the funding being utilized as a local level for local implementation, which the beneficiaries really appreciated. But secondly, the partnership focused on building non-technical skills as well. We appreciate that technical skills are important, and indeed we jointly identified technical capacities to be strengthened. For example, monitoring and evaluation, aligning our local impact to global indicators or frameworks such as the Sustainable Development Goals. But most importantly for this partnership, GPPAC provided very important non-technical capacities, which was very helpful on our side. For example, boosting up our legitimacy as an organization, building our self-confidence, enhancing our ability to engage directly with the donors, as well as leveraging the impact of our project with other donors, such as the UN. Thirdly, the partnership promoted exchanges of lessons learned and best practices among a wider group of local peace builders. We understand that GPPAC is first and foremost a global network of local peace building organizations from across the world. So their focus went beyond just acting as an intermediary or just acting as a project manager to also build synergies and collaboration with other GPPAC members across the world. For example, many of the lessons learned from our project were shared and adopted in other countries like Cameroon, which equally is doing a very tremendous work. And based on this experience and partnership, I would recommend that it's important that donors seek to build partnerships with similar networks based in the South and consisting primarily of local organizations. We feel that this way local organizations would be encouraged to pool their resources together and take on the role of intermediaries themselves, which would be a very good thing. Secondly, we feel that they recommend that the project guidelines should always require intermediaries to be able to build non-technical skills of local partners. And one of the key examples here would be requiring that reporting include a section on the quality of partnership between local partners and intermediaries. And here we could look at indicators like the level of investment of time and resources to build each other's capacities. And would also recommend that during the project design and implementation, is very important that there are phase-out plans that are included to phase out the role of intermediaries, as well as create opportunities for follow-up funding. But we appreciate that not all intermediaries may have to phase out their intermediary role. However, from the lessons that we have learned from our partnership with GPPAC, we feel that the financing process, whether by intermediaries or donors, need to engage with the local partners to ensure that the interventions really respond to the local needs, that they promote active participation, and they are able to build on existing capacities and structures. We have seen this to be a more effective approach of building and sustaining peace in our context. I'll end here for now. Thank you very much. God bless you all.
Thank you so much, Patrick. And now, Aviella, we will move on to you.
Thank you very much, and hello, everybody. My name is Aviella Murray, and I'm currently working with the Social Change Initiative based in Belfast. But actually, my pitch is drawn from my experience in Northern Ireland as Executive Director of the Community Foundation, which acted as an intermediary funder for important aspects of the European Union Peace and Reconciliation Programme, work it did between 1996 and 2014. And I want to concentrate on our approach in terms of explaining what can be very useful, particularly in terms of inclusive participatory grant making. That was really possible because Community Foundation had a track record of being a local grant maker in Northern Ireland, a contested society emerging tentatively from 30 years of violent conflict. And we had the brief of funding local community activism, women's activism, supporting victims and survivors of violence, and promoting the reintegration of political ex-prisoners. And I want to focus on the latter because it was seen as the most challenging. In a society of 1.8 million people, we had some 30,000 ex-prisoners from some 3 Republican paramilitary groups and 2 loyalists. So step 1 of our approach of participatory grant making as a local funder was talking with the various ex-prisoner organizations to invite them to share their fears, aspirations, and priorities. In other words, co-design, not just co-design with the intermediary, but co-design with the potential beneficiaries. Step 2 was to ask them to nominate 2 representatives each to a grant-making advisory committee to join some other informed civil society representatives on it in order to look at proposals coming forward and to recommend decisions to the board of the Community Foundation. Step 3, which was very important, was to organise added value activities, such as visits, bringing the ex-prisoners on visits to Brussels and Leuven to build relationships under cover of learning about the European Union, as well as exposing them to international questions posed by a number of ambassadors to the European Union. So the ex-prisoner grant advisory panel, and indeed we had 8 different advisory panels for other measures as well, invited applications from the full range of ex-prisoner support groups that were then being established. The groups offered practical support as well as channeling information about the ongoing peace process to their members, enabling concerns to be raised and addressed. And this is where grant making and peace building actually met in practice. So under the auspices of the perceived neutrality of the Community Foundation as the intermediary, the ex-prisoner grant advisory panel continued to meet even during the breakdown of initially the IRA and subsequently loyalist ceasefires. In fact, organizational membership of that grant-making panel allowed back-channel negotiations and communications to continue over difficult periods. And that's one of the points that I feel really strongly about. Grant making can be actually part of the process of peace building. What I saw was that the interpersonal relationships built up over time held good during times of tension and stress. Even if there was not always trust, there was certainly ongoing communication, which worked to prevent rumors and misinformation that would have aggravated violence. Was this an easy process? No. There was criticism from elected politicians of various views who saw the inclusive process as providing credibility to people that they were all too ready to demonize. There were efforts to stir up divisiveness over funding allocation. How much was allocated to Republican ex-prisoners as compared to loyalists? How much to paramilitaries as compared to victims of violence? And clearly, some of these questions also were relayed back to the donor, the European Commission. And then, of course, there was the audit questions and to address these, the final decision-making, grant-making responsibility did continue to lie with the Board of Trustees of the Community Foundation. And there was also a certain reluctance by donors to acknowledge the value of small developmental grants, the currency, the social capital of early relationship building and trust. But was this effective grant making for peace building? Yes. There are currently executive ministers in Northern Ireland who served on the earliest ex-prisoner grant advisory committee. But what made it work as peace building was mutual respect, local knowledge and contact, and an understanding that for peace building to be sustainable, it has to be inclusive. So this sort of brings me to my recommendations. First of all, as I mentioned, to recognize the importance of small developmental grants as the building block for perhaps larger initiatives, larger grant making at a later stage, but most importantly, to build relationships and trust. However, alongside that, there has to be proportionate audit requirements. And what we found with the overall donor, the European Commission, the policy people were very much supportive and very much in favor, but there was a lack of communication with the more technical audit requirements and the people involved in that side. Secondly, developing a series of templates and shared practice and peer learning to promote inclusive participatory grant making. And at the moment, we have the Foundations for Peace Network, which the Community Foundation for Northern Ireland was a founder member of, which actually brings together funders, local funders in conflict areas. And finally, to set aside a percentage of the donor program funding for a longer term sustainability fund, because peace building is not short term. And even taking something like 10% of the funding that was spent, that we managed in Northern Ireland, and putting it into an endowed fund, time limited, albeit, but a reasonable time limit would have made such a difference. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Aviella. Simon.
Yes, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure being here today and to listen to these already fantastic interventions that have been there. So I will try and come with a perspective from a donor organization. So I work in what's called the Service for Foreign Policy Instruments of the European Commission, that is dealing with crisis response, conflict prevention and peace building funding activities, where we try, or we're responsible for mainly short-term interventions dealing directly with risk of crisis or active crisis. So I'm very happy to be here today and listen to the very good presentations that have already been there. What I see is that we all agree on where we want to go to. Donors are interested in having impact. So that is the overall objective of what we do. We see a need or an opportunity, and we want to do our best to make sure that the funding we have available goes towards a meaningful change of the situation we are trying to address. In peace building, it's clear that local engagement and local partnership is essential, and it's something that we are actively pursuing. I'm absolutely not saying that we are there yet, but we are doing what we can to get towards it. I think many of the issues that have been raised in the previous three presentations are things that we have already started to build into our calls for proposals. For example, we recently had a call for proposal on conflict and climate, where we got a tremendous amount of response. In the call, there was specifications made both to the types of partnerships that were required in order to apply, and there was also specifically written in to the objectives of the call to build local capacity. So I think both in terms of the implementation part and in terms of the management part, we are making an effort to get towards a situation where the importance of local engagement, local ownership, local design is written in from the beginning of the process, and it doesn't come as an afterthought afterwards. One thing that is always important to remember is that donors are not the same, and different donors are probably better adapted at different parts of the peace building work. So Aviella was mentioning, you know, the issue of, no, sorry, it was Lucia who was mentioning the issue about the big budgets that some donors have, such as the European Union, and the limited amount of staff we have to managing those funds, which means that the funding sizes become quite large very quickly. That being said, there are other parts, even within the European Commission, that have more specific funding available for more local initiatives. And there are other donors that are more specialized and more flexible in terms of their funding requirements. So I think there's also part of the exercise that would be useful both for the donor community and for the practitioners, is to also be more aware of where the opportunities are best fitted for creating the best possible opportunities for organizations also to grow. That being said, local organizations are far from the same. There are very large local organizations as well that are very well established. And I think one of the things that is very important for us also in this discussion is to make sure that we distinguish clearly what we mean by local organizations. Our national organization sitting in the capital of a large country does not necessarily know the context in a particular community better than an international partner. So I think there we have to be good at looking at substance rather than on let's say the nationality that is put on an organization. It is the local connections that are important for us at least. I'm informed about. I have little time left, so I'll go straight to recommendation. So I think one of the things that were both that was mentioned by both Lucia, Patrick, and Aviella was this importance of having the local aspects of an intervention accepted by the donor. And there, my strong recommendation is that we are better at writing these things into the objectives of the project or initiative from the beginning, from the outset. If you write in the building of local capacities as one of the objectives of an action, and if you explain well how that will support peace building efforts, then we avoid that very dangerous gap that Aviella mentioned about communication between the political side of the house and the technical part of the house. As long as things are very explicit in what we agree on doing together, then that gap and that risk is reduced tremendously. And I think there's only good arguments for working closely with local communities on this. And then just a last point, many times the discussion is very much about what donors have to do in order to change rules and regulations and so forth. I think that many times it's as if the power balance is very much in the favor of donors, and I can understand why in many ways, but I think it's also very important to remember that donors need implementers, that we are sincere when we say we need partnerships. We are not interested in just providing funding without building a relationship on the longer term. So it's very important to also focus on building that level of trust. That also means that the communication about the needs can be much more open during the implementation process. I will stop at this point, but I'm happy to discuss afterwards. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Simon. And thank you to all of our speakers. I think you all made some really rich points. Leo, if we could move to our recap slide. This is not inclusive at all, and we are hoping to really gather the thoughts from the audience and perhaps elaborate on some of the issues that our speakers have raised. But just a few ideas about the important, concrete suggestions that we felt came out of this conversation. Aviella's suggestion about budgeting for small developmental grants as a basis for relationship and trust building. And that speaks to what Simon just mentioned about, the need for partnership between donors and local organizations also, that donors also need to find ways to build that relationship and develop trust and communication around needs. Allocating a budget for relationship building versus as, you know, things that we can measure like trainings or other kinds of countable types of outcomes. Lucy talked about the ratio between staff allocation for local partners and intermediaries and how that should always be to the advantage of local partners, and donors should perhaps evaluate projects with an eye to those issues. So, you know, we divided this into three areas: budget, reporting. How do we actually report on, how do we measure or understand the quality of these relationships? So, you know, including a reporting section on the quality of the investment of time and resources to build each other's capacities of the partnership between local partners and intermediary organizations. And as several, Patrick and Lucy, I think all of our speakers in some way spoke to the process of capacity building beyond technical assistance. So Patrick talked about how GPAC's support to them really enabled them to be the primary recipient of donor funding, exactly because GPAC was able to work with them around, you know, the technical assistance pieces that they needed in order to play that role, but then also their legitimacy, their ability to engage with donors, to engage in it directly in the international conversation around these issues. And then finally, really thinking about long-term sustainability. So can part of their role be to help create financial sustainability plans beyond the life of a project? Can a role of an intermediary be to link local partners to other donors and really think about how to phase out the role of the intermediary, as Patrick spoke to. So these were some of our ideas. And again, there were many other themes that were mentioned. You know, Simon spoke to the strategic advantage of different donors, and that was evident in Aviella's reflections also, and the need for all kinds of partnerships and how you really measure what and how you understand what is local. So, you know, I think these are all issues that we'd love to hear your thoughts on. We wanted to know what you would add to this list, and we wanted to give you a minute to respond in the chat. So we aren't going to try another poll, but if you could just take a minute to add your thoughts to what you would add here, either you know, in terms of categories, larger categories, or specific items. So please take a minute to go ahead and do that in the chat. I'm not sure. Does everyone have access to the chat? Great, Marina. Okay, we'll wait just 10 more seconds. And then we'll move into a discussion. So if you have, I already see there are a few hands raised. Please feel free to raise your hand and I will call on you and Leo will unmute you. Great. So we have some great comments in the chat around shifting the power and sort of the movement around shifting the power, and particularly linking in local peace building into that movement, the importance of being consultative. Wonderful. Thank you so much. So please feel free to continue. Our colleagues are moderating the chat and engaged in the chat. Please feel free to continue to add your thoughts to the chat. And if anybody would like to raise a hand, feel free. We will just open the floor to discussion. So please feel free to raise your hand and we'll call on you. Great. Lena. Let's see, Leo, can we unmute Lena?
Hello.
Hi. Good afternoon.
Hello.
Yeah, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Fine, thank you. I am called Lena Godfrey from Uganda, especially from Karamoja. And I want to applaud the work of GPPAC that worked with the Center for Conflict Resolution. And I want to emphasize two issues here. First, the need to actively involve the local partner. And they rightly involved Center for Conflict Resolution in the design of programs and to the implementation. And also guiding a long way in the reporting, evidence-based reporting, that was so good. And it helped SICO also to be able to help the local community to hone the peace processes. And as I speak, in Karamoja now we have a lot of insecurity. The cattle rustling has resumed, but with the skills we gave to the peace champions, they are now championing the fact that they want peace by themselves. So it is sustainable. So what we get from GPPAC is what we give, actually. The other thing is the issue of phasing out. I was happy by the fact that the funds we got from IFA Pacific, there was a strategy of phasing out the intermediary role and helping and giving space to the local partner to take on. And as we speak, I think this is ongoing and it's really good that we can learn. I want to appreciate the fact that, yes, funding has gone away from grants to tenders, matching, and then the capacity of the local partner. That I think the intermediary should be able to support in that kind of role. I want to thank Simon, especially ensuring that, yes, we need consortia nowadays. We need long-term interventions for peace building. Again, it's short-term, which can be talked about if you give inputs. But this one needs a lot of mindset, and especially ensuring that the capacity of the local partners, and also ensuring that this local partner, even at the national level, has branches at the community level. Otherwise, thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that important reflection. And I want to move to some of the comments actually in the chat that are very insightful. And I wonder if I could ask some of our colleagues to elaborate on what they've written. So for example, Benjamin, could you say a little bit more about capacity building efforts? And I think you're making a very important point about not homogenizing organizations in a uniform way. We'd love to hear a little bit more of your thinking about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So this comes particularly from a perspective working with youth peace builders, where frequently there's a worry that, they have innovative ways of organizing their structures within their organizations, of operating, and that capacity building for young organizations should not be just about making them the same as adult organizations, for example, and that we need to recognize the added value of the way that they operate, and that is gives them a sense of legitimacy and provides significant value to peace building work. And so when we're thinking about providing capacity, that it shouldn't be just about making them operate in a traditional way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder if anyone, again, the focus of our conversation today is on concrete recommendations. And I wonder if anyone else, Benjamin or you or anybody else has specific thoughts for donors about how to operationalize that idea of different approaches to capacity building. So that's a question that I wanted to raise. And I also, Barry, thank you for your comment in the chat. I wanted to give you a chance to speak a little bit to the Shift the Power campaign, which you've been instrumental in. And I'm not sure if members of our peace building audience are as familiar, with that work. And so, Barry, I wonder if you could, I could give the floor to you for a moment to talk a little bit about that movement, and particularly how to engage local peace building organizations.
Yeah, thank you, Riva. This is Barry here. The Shift the Power campaign is around 5 years old, and it stems from a meeting in Johannesburg in December 2016, where essentially local organizations, 400 of them, came together really to protest about the behavior of international donors and their top-down efforts, and the points that one of the speakers made about budget allocations, very small amounts of money actually reaching the front lines, community activists on the front lines of conflict in particular. And the peace industrial complex being a rather elitist, white sort of network of power holders who really don't have the appropriate mindsets to understand what it's like on the front line. I know people like Aviella do because she's been on it for years. But I think this is as much about hearts and minds as it is about technocratic issues, about the words like intermediary. The Shift the Power campaign would reject the word intermediary because what it suggests is it's all about moving money from one place to another without actually the organization in the middle of that actually adding value. And the Global Fund for Community Foundations, which has spearheaded the Shift the Power campaign, sees itself very much as a porous institution where people from all over the world can influence it. So I think we need to get beyond just the money and think about powers, because that's what this is really about. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Barry. That's an important reflection, thinking about beyond money. And Marina reflects also your comment in the chat that funding isn't the only support needed, and that we could further explore, support to local organizations on applications and in a range of different processes. Lucy and Patrick, I wanted to ask you to reflect on this issue of support beyond technical assistance and also beyond money. I mean, how do we sort of join in a movement that really addresses power? Maybe we need to stop using the word intermediary. And further, could it be possible to align grants so that there could be progress from smaller to larger funding streams? How can donors support that process that Patrick in particular spoke to, about kind of graduating a local organization to be able to receive funding? What are the capacities that are necessary to be supported in order to do that? Do either of you have any reflections on that?
Okay, I'll plunge into this. I'm interested in the idea of rejecting intermediary and going beyond money and thinking about power. Clearly in this conflict, not even conflict, I don't like to use that word, the situation of occupation where I'm living, it's a lot about power and also a lot about credit, I think. It's also the visibility that the organizations that give the money can take. They can take credit for things, whereas the less visible local organizations often don't get that same level of visibility. So that plays into the power, I think. And about graduating, it depends again, really, I think, on the relationship. We've heard several people emphasize the importance of building trust. And when there is trust, I think this can work. But sometimes, again, there is exploitation. A donor will say, right, well, we will give you a maximum of 5,000 euros. You prove yourselves. And then we will go on and you can become a partner. But it doesn't mean that even if you do everything absolutely perfectly and write excellent reports and do everything on time, it depends on the donor whether they follow up with that. So there has to be actually real integrity in the relationship, I think. And that's perhaps what's needed also to get away from this term intermediary. Maybe some of the fault is in this, that if the people who currently see themselves as intermediaries were to start thinking of themselves as partners and as co-creators and co-peace builders with the local organizations, this might actually affect how the work could be more productive. Thank you.
Thank you. And building on that, Patrick, I wanted to see if you have any further responses to that, those ideas around power and any additions to your comments about graduating, you know, sort of to larger and direct management of support, but also you made a point about building local platforms, and there have been several points in the chat about setting resources aside, that donors could set resources aside for convening groups to learn from one another, from more exchanges around best practices and worst practices and study tours. I know donors also already do this to some extent, but I know you have, Patrick, some interesting reflections about local platforms and that process. Could I ask you to share those?
Yeah, thank you very much. One of the things that helps this partnership was from the start to all know that we're in a partnership and a genuine partnership. Sometimes partnerships are there by name, but not in practice. But I think for us, we ensured that we walk to the talk. And this one enabled us to have a very constructive engagement and joint consultations, looking at what is it that we needed? What was the missing gap? And then we focused on filling the missing gap. We asked ourselves, yes, we need capacity, but capacity for who? Capacity for what? And most of these answers came from the community, the beneficiaries themselves. For example, one of the responses was we need to build the capacity of the peace committees on at the grassroots level to be able to carry on the peace building activities after this project. So we're able to engage the local communities directly, to build the relationship, to build the confidence that they can take on, and then prepare in terms of skills and the mind to be able to carry on the activities. And of course, the issue of investing in relationship is not like it has to be, you have to allocate a lot of money to maybe a big budget towards it. These are just relationships we made, like the ones we built. It was virtually without any coin. For example, the best practices we shared with our partners in Cameroon and they adopted, we didn't invest any monetary kind of sense into that. The confidence, the relationship, the connections that were given, we didn't have to invest much in that. So it's a matter of practically moving the talk. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Very helpful to hear your ideas from, having lived these experiences and done this work. I wanted to turn to Lexi. I think your comment in the chat is really interesting around the reflections about what needs to change structurally about intermediaries to enable the kind of mutual partnerships that we're talking about. I'd love for you to say a little bit more about that and hear from any others who have reflections on that.
Yeah, thanks, Riva. I do have to drop off at the top of the hour, so I'm going to miss the answer. But I'm hearing a lot about kind of the practices that intermediaries should be taking on in their partnerships with their local partners. And I was just curious, do we think the current structures of intermediaries are conducive to taking on those practices in a real way? Or should we also be thinking about how intermediaries should be structured in terms of decision-making, staffing, what departments they have, what kind of policy influencing they focus on, and things like that? And I'd be interested to hear people's reflection on that.
Great, thank you. So would I. Does anybody want to raise their hand and jump in about how to create structural changes so that we can enable some of the issues that we're talking about? Simon.
Thank you very much, and sorry for coming in again, but I really think that all these points are very relevant, and I think some of them I tried to touch on some of them before. I think that the point on power, I think the mutual need of donors to implementing partners, between what you call intermediaries and local implementation capacity. There is a power relationship there that goes two ways, and I think it's not necessarily exploited enough in the two ways. And then to jump to the example of good examples of how to be an intermediary. So normally we would not use the word intermediary, we would use the partnership term, whatever the organization we work with is. But we have one example, which is not from the instrument I'm managing right now, but from our longer term development instrument, where in a country in conflict, there was very little space for local NGOs in the past, meaning that there was very little possibility of having a registered NGO with a financial track record, which often is a requirement to access donor funding, at least for larger amounts. There was a group, a consortium of international organizations that identified that as a problem, and they got together to implement the project. And as part of their proposal, there was the capacity building of the local organizations as an integrated part of the proposal. That meant that they had all the guarantees from the technical sides, the auditors of the house, that these expenditures would be accepted. And they had the specific goal of making sure that the local partners graduated to be able to take funding themselves afterwards. And they managed to do so. So after 4 years of implementation, they all had the sufficient financial track records, accounts, registration, and so forth, that allowed them to take on the next funding circle. The interesting part of that was that the dynamic between the local organizations changed dramatically after they got access to the funding themselves and created a system of, let's say, intermediary and implementers within that group. But that's a whole other discussion. Thank you very much.
Simon, can I just ask for a clarification on, so from the EU donor side, were there requirements built into that project that enabled you to kind of assess the progress?
Well, the progress was assessed at the end of it, so it's difficult to evaluate that before the end of the process. I was not the manager of the project. I only know what the result was of it. But my point is basically, you can do more or less whatever you want to do if you are explicit about it and if it makes sense. Mm-hmm. The problem comes when you have a perception of what is expected by the donor and you try to write to that purpose rather than being explicit about what it is what is intended. Mm-hmm. We are looking for good ideas because we're looking for impact. So I think that also the point that was made by the gentleman about the youth organizations, I think it's just important, if one does not want to conform to the standard framework, to explain why there is a difference and explain why it makes sense. At least we are aiming to take that into consideration every time we have a proposal. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'd love to turn to Aviella, who I think had raised her hand earlier, but also to your comment about building in developmental grants, and also to some of the other funders in our conversation around how they were able to to Simon's comments, do what made sense, right? How are you able to make some of these ideas, developmental grants, building in the goal of having organizations manage funding directly? How have you been able to do that in your systems? So Aviella, over to you.
Thanks very much. Just a couple of points about the important question about the structure of intermediaries themselves. I mean, I think this is very crucial. I mean, first of all, there is the issue of location that a number of people have raised in terms of, the sort of the sense of ownership and knowledge of the conflict circumstances, but also the composition of the actual, the decision-making processes of the intermediary. Are they all based, in the West? Are they all sort of the professional staff that migrate from one conflict to another? And really crucially, and as a Sri Lankan partner actually raised this with me, what happens when there's trouble? How do they respond? A lot, we've known intermediaries that are located in Western Europe who respond by actually looking after their own staff and leaving their partners, in inverted commas, on the ground to manage for themselves. So it's grand to look at what happens when it goes right. The real issue is what happens when things go wrong. And I think that is really important. And that's where it actually does come down to power. The point about the developmental grants, I mean, and capacity building. First of all, I've already said about the importance of the relationship building. But secondly, it actually precludes people, I think. People perhaps, certainly my experience, women who perhaps are unemployed or whose families are unemployed are put off with the idea of having to manage large grants, even if it's for their local areas. Large grants attract in the professionals, the people who have a career path in this area. Whereas the developmental grants allow a sort of people to build the confidence, as has been pointed out, in terms of managing those funding, but also allow those that are closest to the impact of the conflict to actually be involved. And in some cases, actually, it's horses for courses. I mean, a lot of our small grants were to fund people who had actually been involved in the conflict to actually literally go and sit down and talk to their colleagues, their ex-comrades, their ex-combatants, whatever else, about what was happening in the peace process. Now, that didn't take a lot of money, but that was peace building as compared to perhaps, creating a building or putting in training courses or whatever else. So, there is a role, I think, depending on your understanding of peace building in terms of those developmental grants. But yes, certainly we also had the experience of, building on those grants in some cases to give much larger grant making later on. So there is that graduated support as well. And the last point I would make is the problem with a lot of donors in terms of projects or programs, it's almost as though they see peace building as a sort of a linear process that goes along without any sort of hiccups or bumps in the road. We all know it's not like that. And actually, what's really important is to build in not just co-design at an early stage of putting out a call for applications, but have a built-in peace and conflict analysis that's inclusive on an annual basis, or perhaps even on a 6-monthly basis, depending on how the conflict is actually developing or peace building is developing in any specific circumstance.
Aviella, thank you. And if I could ask you just one follow-on question, these practices that you are speaking of, focusing on processes, relationship building, small grants to support people talking to each other, the assessing a situation, and I appreciate your comment about looking at what's, when things go wrong. How is it possible to feed these practices? And this is something we've talked a lot about in our group, that, there are these effective practices out there. How do we, and Simon, perhaps this is a final thought for you also, how do we shift these big donor systems? Is there a way what is the most effective way of feeding these practices that are already happening, that are effective, into these systems?
I mean, what we found, and it seems very almost sort of micro to say it, was actually, finding the sympathetic champions within the systems. Now, okay, there's always a problem of continuity. They may, they move on in terms of their career path or whatever else. But certainly sort of, writing papers, whatever else, doesn't have the same impact as actually trying to find the champion that can actually sort of put forward the arguments that are coming from the ground. And as Barry says, have been coming from the ground for quite a number of years now.
Great. I think that finding champions versus writing papers. And Simon, did you want to just add anything quickly? And then we will turn it to Mariska for her closing thoughts.
I think Aviella is right on with this. I think there is a lot of understanding within the organizations, donor organizations. There is an intention of doing the right thing, and events like this help this, but obviously nothing replaces the personal interactions. But there are a lot of ears in donor communities who are listening to good ideas, who want to have good ideas and want to support them. So I think you're right on with that. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much to both of you. And now we will turn the floor to Mariska van Beenem for some closing thoughts.
Thank you so much, Riva, and thank you to our speakers, of course, but also to the participants. It's been a rich discussion. As you can see, the sun is actually coming up right behind me. I take that as a good sign that we actually have energy behind all of our thinking here. For me, as being part of this project that Marie-Laure and Riva already explained, what I very much take from this
Mariska, I think you.
Hold on.
Uh-oh. Mariska, can you hear us?
Go ahead. You should be able to speak now. Yes, you're correct. You're good to go.
You are faint. I'm not sure if it's your Wi-Fi. Maybe can we turn off the video? Your video?
Yeah. Oh, Mariska, go to Leo.
Apologies, everyone. Zoom problems.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
So it seems to be the story of my life. Those of you that have been working with us on this project, I have bad internet connection following me around, which is not a good thing in the current day and age. So apologies for that. I will actually then make my closing remarks really, really short. What I was saying, as apparently I was frozen, was first of all, of course, to thank all of you so much for the contributions and specifically our speakers. And what I take specifically from this conversation, this I think is a very useful reminder, is the push and the urge to not only focus on what is it that we can do in terms of adjusting, let's say, more technical issues within calls for proposals, and focus on where does the money go and where does the budget go, but to
I'm going to allow myself and take over. Is this okay? So just to quickly, yeah, we have 1 minute. So as I indicated earlier, we are really encouraged by the fact that there's willingness and interest among the main stakeholder to start exploring new approaches and to pilot new models and to learn from those pilots in an effort to help push the boundaries on this conversation. And so what our project with radical flexibility will result in is a working paper that focuses on these key elements donors and fund managers should consider when seeking to utilize and design more innovative approaches to financing local peace building. Specifically, we will explore how the building blocks of different models or instruments can be adjusted to strengthen the ownership of local organizations. And we hope to discuss a draft version of that paper with some of you and intermediary organization or fund managers and donors in the beginning of 2022. So if you're interested to be part of this discussion, I think the last slide, Leo, I don't know if you can put it on, you can reach out to us, to either Riva, Mariska, or myself, and we will follow up directly with you. But from now, we would like to thank once again our wonderful speakers, Lucy, Patrick, Aviella, and Simon, and of course to thank our host Leo and KPSRL for this wonderful annual conference this year. And of course, thank you all for participating. And on behalf of GPAC and RFF and our own network. So, Riva, if you have one last thing to say.
No, I understand that our colleagues have lost their internet connection completely. So Sarka, Mariska, and Leo. So they also extend thanks, and thanks to all of you for joining us. Apologies for the technical issues. And as Marie Laura said, please feel free to reach out to us. You can find our email addresses online. And we would love to hear your thoughts and include you as we wrap up this project. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Lucy, Patrick.